long before the desert became hot beneath the afternoon sun, before market voices drifted through narrow village roads, before fishing boats slowly crossed the Nile, the world beside the river rested in deep silence. The air was cool. Soft wind moved through fields of barley and emmer wheat. Tall reeds along the dark water bent gently, making quiet brushing sounds that almost disappeared into the night. Mud brick homes stood close together beneath the stars, their flat roofs pale under moonlight. Most windows were dark now. Most fires had already gone out. The village slept peacefully beside the Nile. And in that silence, ancient Egypt felt less like a kingdom of pharaohs and giant pyramids, and more like a place filled with ordinary families trying to live gentle, careful lives beside the river that fed them. Far away, stone temples stood beneath the same sky. Priests rested inside cool chambers filled with incense and shadow. Guards watched palace gates while torches flickered against carved walls. Scribes slept beside unfinished scrolls covered with careful symbols painted in black and red ink. But none of those places mattered as much to the villagers as the river itself. The Nile was everything. It brought water to dry earth. It carried fish through the reeds. It fed crops beneath the hot Egyptian sun. It connected one village to another like a long blue road stretching through the land. Without the Nile, the villages would disappear into the desert. And so the people lived beside it quietly, carefully, respectfully, shaping their lives around its slow and patient rhythm. Tonight, the river moved gently through darkness. A small fishing boat rocked softly against a wooden post near the shore. Nets lay folded neatly inside it, still damp from yesterday's work. Nearby, an old clay jar sat beside the water, half buried in cool sand. Inside one small house near the edge of the village, a family slept together in a single room. The walls were made from mud mixed with straw, dried hard beneath years of sunlight. The roof above them was flat and simple, built from wooden beams covered with packed earth. Small cracks lined the walls, but the home still held warmth from the previous day. A low oil lamp rested near the doorway, its flame now gone. The father slept closest to the door. His hands were rough from farming. Thin lines of dust still remained beneath his fingernails even after washing before sleep. His breathing was slow and heavy after a long day working in the fields. Beside him rested his wife beneath a woven linen cloth. Her dark hair spread softly across a small reed pillow. Earlier that evening she had baked bread beside the cooking fire while speaking quietly with neighbors passing outside. The smell of smoke and warm grain still lingered faintly in the room. Near their feet, two children slept side by side. The younger boy held a small carved wooden toy in one hand even while sleeping. The older girl rested quietly beside him, her face turned toward the wall where moonlight touched the mud brick with pale silver color. The room was small. But it was enough. Most village homes in ancient Egypt were simple like this. Families did not fill their houses with unnecessary things. Life beside the Nile depended on usefulness. Clay jars stored water and grain. Wooden stools sat near low tables. Baskets held onions, lentils, dates, and dried fish. Reed mats covered packed dirt floors. Everything had a purpose. Everything was used carefully. Outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond the homes, a donkey shifted softly in its sleep. A goat pulled gently against a rope stake beside a fence made from bundled reeds. Then silence returned again. The stars above Egypt were bright during those quiet hours before dawn. Without smoke from large cities or bright lanterns covering the sky, the heavens stretched clearly over the river valley. Ancient villagers often looked upward at night and saw thousands of stars scattered across the darkness like pale grains spilled across black stone. Some believed the stars were connected to the gods. Others simply accepted them as part of the world around them, as natural and familiar as the river itself. An old grandmother sleeping on a nearby rooftop opened her eyes for a moment and stared upward quietly. The night breeze felt cool against her skin. During hotter months, many villagers slept on rooftops beneath the open sky where moving air made rest easier. From above, the village looked peaceful. Mud brick homes stood close together like sleeping shapes beneath moonlight. Beyond them stretched dark fields waiting for sunrise. And beyond the fields rested the silent desert. The desert always surrounded Egypt. To the villagers, it felt endless. During daytime, hot winds sometimes carried pale sand across roads and fields. Travelers crossing distant desert paths often disappeared into shimmering heat for days or weeks at a time. But at night, the desert became calm and cold beneath the stars. Now, in the final quiet moments before dawn, Egypt waited peacefully between darkness and light. Soon everything would change. Soon the first birds would begin calling from the reeds beside the Nile. Soon women would rise to grind grain into flour. Soon men would carry tools toward the fields while children rubbed sleep from their eyes beside cooking fires. But not yet. For now, the village still rested. A faint gray color slowly appeared along the eastern horizon. The night was ending. And little by little, ancient Egyptian life began to wake again. The first sound came softly from the river. A bird cried out from the reeds near the shore, breaking the silence of dawn. Then another answered farther away. Soon quiet movement spread through the village as sleeping animals shifted beneath fences and tied boats rocked gently against the water. The sky slowly changed from black to deep blue. Morning was arriving over Egypt. Inside the small mud brick house near the edge of the village, the mother opened her eyes first. For a few moments she remained still, listening to the familiar sounds around her. Her children still slept beside her. Outside, faint footsteps moved along the narrow dirt road between houses. Somewhere nearby, someone coughed softly. A clay jar scraped against stone as another family began preparing for the day. The woman sat up carefully so she would not wake the children too quickly. Cool morning air drifted through the doorway. She wrapped light linen cloth around herself and quietly crossed the room. Near the wall stood a grinding stone beside a basket filled with grain from the previous harvest. She knelt beside it and began the slow daily work of turning grain into flour. The sound was gentle. Stone against grain. Back and forth. Again and again. Across the village, many women were already doing the same thing. Long before sunrise fully reached the fields, Egyptian village life quietly began with this familiar rhythm. Grinding grain took time. Bread was the center of daily life for most families. Rich or poor, almost everyone in Egypt depended on bread for food each day. Workers carried it into fields. Children ate it beside the river. Travelers packed it carefully before long journeys. So every morning, flour had to be prepared. The woman worked patiently while faint light slowly entered the room. Behind her, the father finally stirred awake. He sat up slowly, stretching tired muscles from yesterday's labor beneath the sun. Through the doorway he could already see pale gold color beginning to touch the distant horizon. Another hot day would come soon. But for now, the air still felt cool and pleasant. He stood quietly and stepped outside. The village around him was waking gently. Thin smoke began rising from cooking fires. Donkeys brayed lazily near small fenced areas beside homes. A few villagers crossed the narrow road carrying water jars balanced carefully on their shoulders. Farther away, beyond the houses, the Nile reflected early morning light like moving silver. The farmer breathed deeply. The smell of wet earth mixed with smoke, river water, and baking grain filled the air. These smells had surrounded him since childhood. They were the smells of ordinary Egyptian life. He walked toward a clay basin near the doorway and washed his face and hands with cool water stored from the previous evening. Water was precious in village life. Families carried it carefully from wells, canals, or directly from the Nile itself. Large clay jars stored it inside homes where it stayed cooler during hot afternoons. Nearby, another family was already feeding goats beside their house. A little boy struggled sleepily while carrying a bundle of reeds almost as large as himself. His older sister laughed softly while helping him untangle the rope around one goat's neck. Across the road, an elderly man sat outside on a low stool watching the sun rise quietly. He no longer worked long hours in the fields like younger men. Age had bent his back and slowed his legs. But every morning he still woke early beside the village, listening to familiar sounds that had filled his life for decades. The old man watched the eastern sky brighten over the Nile. The river looked peaceful this morning. That mattered greatly. The Nile controlled everything. Each year the river flooded the land, leaving behind dark rich soil perfect for farming. Villagers waited carefully for those floods because they determined whether crops would grow well or fail. Good flooding brought life. Poor flooding brought fear and hunger. So Egyptian families watched the river closely. They respected it deeply. Now, as sunlight slowly spread across the fields, the village became more active. Children woke reluctantly from sleep. Clay ovens warmed beside homes. Women mixed flour with water to prepare bread dough while speaking quietly with neighbors nearby. The farmer returned inside his house. His wife had already finished grinding enough grain for the morning meal. Fine dust covered her hands and arms. She smiled faintly as he entered, and together they prepared breakfast in comfortable silence. Their daughter now sat awake near the wall, rubbing tired eyes while holding her younger brother close beside her. The little boy still looked half asleep. Soon the smell of baking bread filled the room. Simple round loaves cooked over heated clay surfaces while the family sat together on reed mats waiting patiently. Beside the bread were onions, dates, and a small amount of dried fish left from earlier meals. The food was modest. But it was enough. For many Egyptian villagers, daily life depended on careful balance. Grain had to last between harvests. Water needed protection from heat. Tools required repair instead of replacement. Nothing was wasted if it could still serve a purpose. Even broken pottery sometimes found new life holding grain or supporting cooking fires. Outside, sunlight now touched the upper walls of the village homes. Golden light spread slowly across mud brick, fields, and narrow roads. Workers began gathering tools for the long day ahead. Wooden plows rested beside fences. Coiled rope lay near baskets waiting to be carried into fields. The peaceful coolness of morning would not last long. Soon heat would cover the land. But early hours beside the Nile were often beautiful. Birds moved low across the water. Palm trees stood nearly still in the gentle breeze. Boats drifted quietly between riverbanks carrying fishermen, farmers, and traders beginning another ordinary day in ancient Egypt. The father finished his meal slowly. Soon he would leave for the fields. Soon the village would become busy beneath the rising sun. And all across the Nile Valley, thousands of other families were beginning their mornings in almost exactly the same way. After breakfast, the village slowly emptied into the fields. Men carried wooden tools across narrow dirt paths while older children followed behind with baskets, rope, and clay water jars. The morning sun climbed steadily higher, warming the earth beneath their sandals. From a distance, the village looked small beside the wide green farmland surrounding it. Beyond the fertile land rested the desert, pale and endless beneath the brightening sky. But near the Nile, life grew thick and green. Barley swayed gently in the breeze. Date palms cast long shadows across irrigation canals. Patches of onions, beans, lettuce, and flax spread across carefully tended earth. Everything depended on this land. And the land depended on the river. The farmer from the small mud brick house walked beside two neighbors toward the fields east of the village. They spoke quietly as they moved along the dusty road. No one hurried. The day would be long no matter how quickly it began. Ahead of them, a pair of oxen waited beside a wooden plow near the edge of a field still dark from recent irrigation. The animals flicked their tails lazily against flies while morning sunlight warmed their backs. The farmer placed one hand gently against the neck of one ox before beginning work. These animals were valuable to village families. Strong oxen could pull heavy plows through thick soil far more easily than men alone. Families cared for them carefully because healthy animals meant stronger harvests. Nearby, another group of workers repaired irrigation channels leading from the Nile. Water management was one of the most important parts of Egyptian farming life. Small canals carried river water toward crops, and villagers constantly checked them for damage or blockage. If canals failed, fields dried quickly beneath the powerful sun. The work was repetitive, slow, steady. But the villagers understood every movement through years of practice. The farmer guided the oxen forward. The wooden plow cut through damp earth while birds followed behind searching for insects uncovered in the soil. Dust rose softly around their feet. Sweat slowly formed along the farmer's arms as the sun climbed higher overhead. This was ordinary life beside the Nile. Most people in ancient Egypt spent their days farming. Great temples and royal tombs may have become famous across history, but villages survived because of endless daily labor in these quiet fields. Wheat had to grow. Canals needed repair. Animals required feeding. Without constant work, the entire rhythm of Egyptian life would weaken. Still, there was peace in the routine. The farmer knew these fields deeply. He knew where soil stayed wet longest after irrigation. He knew which areas produced stronger crops during dry seasons. He knew the feeling of mud beneath sandals during flood months and the rough cracked earth during hotter times of year. The land changed slowly. And the villagers changed with it. By mid-morning, the village women were also busy with their own work. Near the riverbank, several women washed linen clothing beside smooth stones while children played nearby in shallow water. They spoke quietly together as they worked, their voices blending with splashing water and distant bird calls. Others remained inside the village preparing food, repairing baskets, weaving cloth, or grinding more grain beneath shaded areas beside their homes. Life inside Egyptian villages rarely stopped moving. Even simple tasks required patience and time. One woman sat beneath a woven shade covering, carefully spinning flax fibers into thread. Her fingers moved calmly through familiar motions while her small daughter watched beside her. Later the thread would become linen cloth used for clothing, bedding, or trade. Nearby, another woman shaped wet clay into small bowls while her husband repaired cracked pottery near the doorway of their home. The smell of damp earth mixed with smoke from cooking fires drifting slowly through the warm air. Children wandered between homes carrying messages, gathering reeds, or helping younger brothers and sisters. Older boys sometimes joined men in the fields while older girls learned household tasks beside mothers and grandmothers. Everyone belonged to the rhythm of village life. Everyone had work to do. Back in the fields, the heat became stronger. The farmer paused beside the canal and drank carefully from a clay water jar wrapped in damp cloth to keep it cool. Around him, insects buzzed softly above the crops while distant palm trees shimmered slightly beneath rising heat. The sky over Egypt often looked enormous during midday. Clouds were rare. Blue stretched endlessly above the land while sunlight covered everything in pale gold brightness. Workers protected themselves as best they could with linen clothing and simple head coverings. Still, the heat entered every part of daily life. Sweat darkened cloth. Sand stuck to skin. Hands became rough from tools, rope, and earth. But these conditions were familiar. The villagers had lived beside the sun for generations. As noon slowly approached, work continued steadily across the Nile Valley. And above the quiet fields, birds circled lazily through the warm Egyptian sky. By the time the sun stood high above the Nile, the village had become quiet again. Not silent, but slower. The heat of midday settled gently over the land like a heavy blanket. Bright sunlight covered the mud brick homes, the narrow dirt roads, the canals, and the distant fields where workers still moved carefully through the shimmering air. Even the animals seemed quieter now. Goats rested beside shaded walls. Donkeys stood nearly motionless beneath palm trees, their ears flicking lazily at flies. Chickens scratched slowly through dry earth near cooking fires that had burned lower during the hottest part of the day. The village breathed differently beneath the afternoon sun. Inside the fields, the farmer wiped sweat from his forehead with the edge of his linen cloth. The wooden handle of the plow felt hot against his hands now. Nearby, another man repaired a broken canal edge with slow careful movements while muddy water flowed gently around his ankles. No one wasted energy speaking loudly in the heat. Voices became softer. Movements became slower. The workers understood that the sun would remain strong for many more hours. Their bodies had learned patience through years of labor beneath Egyptian skies. Along the edge of the field, several men finally paused beneath a small group of date palms for a short rest. They sat together on the ground, sharing bread, onions, and cool water from clay jars wrapped in damp cloth. The shade felt precious. One older worker closed his eyes for a moment while warm wind moved softly through the palm leaves overhead. Another stared quietly toward the river where fishing boats drifted slowly through the bright sunlight. The Nile itself seemed sleepy during these afternoon hours. The water moved gently, reflecting flashes of white light beneath the enormous sky. Reeds along the banks barely stirred. Small insects hovered over the surface while fishermen rested beneath cloth coverings stretched across their boats. Everything slowed beneath the heat. Back inside the village, women remained busy within shaded homes and courtyards. The mother from the small house near the edge of the village sat beside a low table repairing worn linen clothing with careful stitches. Her daughter rested nearby weaving reeds into a basket while the younger boy slept quietly on a mat close to the wall. The room smelled faintly of bread, warm clay, and smoke from the cooking fire. Outside, sunlight pressed hard against the mud brick walls, but inside the thick house the air remained cooler and dimmer. Small homes like these were built carefully for Egypt's climate. Thick walls helped protect families from the powerful afternoon heat, and tiny windows allowed only small amounts of sunlight to enter. The woman worked slowly and patiently. Nothing inside the village was thrown away quickly. Old clothing became patches for newer garments. Broken baskets were repaired and used again. Clay jars with cracks still stored grain if they could no longer carry water safely. Village families lived close to necessity. Every object mattered. Even small amounts of food were handled carefully. Near another home, an elderly grandmother prepared lentils inside a blackened clay pot while her grandchildren watched beside her. The smell drifted slowly through the narrow road outside. One child leaned sleepily against her shoulder while she stirred the pot with a wooden spoon polished smooth through years of use. The old woman spoke softly as she cooked. She told quiet stories about floods from long ago when the Nile rose especially high and covered nearly every field near the village. The children listened carefully while flies buzzed lazily in the heat nearby. Stories were important in village life. Most people never traveled far from the places where they were born. Villages remained connected to the outside world through travelers, merchants, priests, soldiers, and stories passed from one person to another beneath evening skies. Children learned about life by listening. They listened while sitting beside cooking fires, while helping with chores, while resting after long days beneath the sun. And slowly, year after year, village knowledge passed quietly from one generation into the next. Farther down the road, a potter worked beneath a woven shade covering beside his house. Wet clay spun slowly beneath his hands while he shaped another storage jar for grain. Beside him stood rows of finished pottery drying carefully in the sunlight. Some jars would hold water. Others would carry beer, oil, or dried fish. A few might travel by boat to neighboring villages along the Nile. The potter's young son watched every movement closely. One day the work would belong to him. In ancient Egyptian villages, children usually followed the work of their families. Farmers raised future farmers. Potters taught their sons how to shape clay. Weavers passed skills carefully to daughters and granddaughters. Life changed slowly. The same routines repeated season after season, generation after generation. And because of that, villages often felt deeply stable, almost untouched by time itself. Still, the world beyond the village continued moving. Occasionally travelers appeared along dusty roads carrying goods from distant towns. Tax collectors sometimes arrived by boat to count grain harvests. Messengers brought news from larger cities farther down the Nile. But most days remained simple. Most days were shaped by sunlight, labor, meals, rest, and sleep. As afternoon continued, the heat became almost blinding across the open fields. The farmer and the other workers finally stopped for a longer rest beside the canal. Some removed sandals and placed tired feet into the cool muddy water. Others simply sat quietly in the shade without speaking. Above them, the sky looked pale with brightness. Insects hummed steadily through the dry air. A warm breeze carried the smell of river water and wet soil across the land. The farmer looked toward the distant village where sunlight glowed against the mud brick homes. From far away, the houses almost blended into the earth itself, their colors nearly matching the dusty land around them. Smoke rose slowly from a few cooking fires. Children moved like tiny shadows between the buildings. And beyond it all, the Nile flowed onward through Egypt exactly as it had for countless years before any of them were born. The river never hurried. It simply continued forward, calm and steady beneath the sun. And beside its ancient waters, village life moved with the same quiet rhythm. As the hottest hours of afternoon slowly passed, the children became lively again. Inside the small house near the edge of the village, the young boy finally woke from his nap and stepped outside barefoot into the warm sunlight. Dust clung softly to his feet as he wandered toward the narrow road between homes where other children had already gathered. The air still felt hot, but the sharp weight of midday was beginning to fade. Long shadows slowly stretched across the village ground. Nearby, a group of children played beside stacked baskets and clay jars near a shaded wall. One little girl carried a doll made from cloth and reeds. Another child pushed a small wooden toy animal through the dirt while laughing quietly. Their games were simple. Most toys inside Egyptian villages were handmade from wood, clay, cloth, or woven reeds. Children played with carved animals, rag dolls, spinning objects, and smooth stones collected near the riverbank. But often, imagination itself became the greatest toy. A narrow road became a river. A stick became a fishing spear. A pile of straw became a palace. The children played together beneath the warm afternoon light while adults continued their work nearby. Life in Egyptian villages rarely separated children completely from the daily routines of adults. From a young age, boys and girls watched carefully as older family members farmed, cooked, repaired tools, carried water, or cared for animals. Learning happened naturally. Slowly. Quietly. A young girl might begin helping grind grain beside her mother long before she became fully grown. Boys learned how to guide animals, repair nets, or dig irrigation canals by following fathers and older brothers into the fields. Still, childhood existed here too. There were moments for laughter. Moments for games beside the Nile. Moments for running barefoot through warm dust while sunlight covered the village walls in soft gold color. Near the riverbank, several boys splashed through shallow water chasing tiny fish between the reeds. Their voices echoed softly across the calm surface of the Nile while an older fisherman repaired his net nearby. The fisherman smiled faintly as he watched them. He remembered doing the same thing many years earlier when he himself had been small. The Nile shaped childhood deeply. Children learned early to respect the river's power while also depending upon its gifts. They gathered reeds along the shore, watched boats drift by, listened to stories about flood seasons, and learned how important the water was for every part of life. Without the Nile, there would be no fields, no bread, no village, no Egypt. And so the river became part of every memory from childhood onward. Farther back inside the village, a group of older girls sat together beneath a shaded covering weaving reeds into baskets. Their fingers moved quickly while they spoke softly among themselves. The work was repetitive but peaceful. Reeds from the Nile were used for many things inside Egyptian villages. Families made mats, baskets, sandals, roofing material, writing brushes, fishing traps, and even small boats from river reeds carefully dried beneath the sun. Very little went unused. The girls worked while nearby chickens scratched through the dirt searching for food. Warm wind carried faint smells of clay, smoke, and river mud through the narrow roads between homes. An old dog slept beneath a wooden cartwheel nearby, barely moving except to flick away flies with its tail. Above the village, the sky slowly deepened into richer afternoon color. The worst heat had finally passed. In the fields, the workers rose again after resting beside the canals. There were still many hours of daylight remaining, and the crops required constant attention. The farmer stood slowly, stretching his tired back. His body ached from labor, but such discomfort was familiar. Most adults inside Egyptian villages carried signs of hard work across their hands, shoulders, knees, and feet. Farming beside the Nile demanded strength and patience year after year. Yet there was quiet pride in the work too. A strong harvest meant food for families. It meant survival through difficult seasons. It meant children sleeping safely with full stomachs at night. The farmer lifted his tools again and returned to the fields while birds drifted lazily overhead. And back in the village, the children continued playing beneath the slow and peaceful Egyptian afternoon. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, movement returned to the river. The Nile had rested quietly beneath the harsh midday sun, but now boats once again drifted across the shining water. Long narrow fishing boats cut gently through the current while wider wooden vessels carried grain, pottery, baskets, and bundles of flax between villages farther along the river banks. The Nile was more than water. It was a road. A lifeline. A moving path connecting nearly every corner of ancient Egypt. Near the village shore, the fisherman who had watched the children earlier finally finished repairing his net. He stood carefully, stretching stiff muscles while warm wind moved across the river surface. His small boat waited beside the bank. The wood was worn smooth from years of use. Rope tied carefully along the sides held together small repairs made over many seasons. Inside rested folded nets, a wooden paddle, and several clay jars for carrying water and fish. Nothing about the boat looked grand. But to the fisherman, it was precious. The Nile fed his family just as the fields fed the farmers. He stepped into the boat slowly, pushing away from shore with practiced ease. The water rocked gently beneath him while nearby reeds brushed softly against the wooden sides. The children watched him drift outward. Soon they returned to their own games while the fisherman moved quietly farther across the river. The afternoon light over Egypt had become softer now. Bright white sunlight slowly turned golden, spreading warm color across the fields and mud brick homes. Palm trees cast long shadows toward the water. Birds crossed low above the river searching for insects among the reeds. Everything felt calmer during these hours. Even the workers in the fields moved with quieter energy as evening slowly approached. The farmer wiped dust from his arms while guiding the oxen toward another section of land near the canal. The animals looked tired now. Their slow breathing matched the steady rhythm of the day itself. Nearby, another worker carried bundles of cut reeds toward the village. Others checked irrigation channels one final time before darkness would arrive. The sounds of labor continued softly across the land. Wood scraping earth. Water moving through canals. Low voices carried by warm wind. And always, somewhere nearby, the slow endless sound of the Nile. Inside the village, cooking fires began to burn more strongly again. Thin gray smoke drifted upward into the evening sky while women prepared the night meal for their families. The smell of baking bread mixed with onions, lentils, herbs, and fish carried gently through the narrow roads. The mother from the small mud brick house knelt beside the cooking fire while her daughter helped shape dough into flat round loaves. The younger boy sat nearby watching flames flicker beneath the clay oven. Outside, neighbors spoke quietly together while carrying water jars back from the river. Evening often brought a feeling of relief to Egyptian villages. The hardest heat had passed. The sky softened. And slowly, families gathered together again after long hours of separate work. Near the center of the village, an old man sat beneath a date palm carving small wooden figures with a knife worn smooth from years of use. A few children gathered nearby to watch him work. His hands moved slowly but carefully. One small carving looked like a bird. Another resembled a cow. The children sat quietly while evening light touched the old man's face. He spoke softly about earlier times when he had traveled farther down the Nile as a younger man helping transport grain by boat. The children listened with wide eyes. To them, distant cities along the river felt almost mysterious. Most village families rarely traveled far from home. Their world centered around the fields, the river, nearby villages, and the changing seasons of flood and harvest. Yet stories allowed them to imagine places beyond the horizon. They imagined great temples covered in painted walls. They imagined crowded river docks filled with merchants and sailors. They imagined enormous statues watching silently over palace gates. But eventually, nearly every story returned again to ordinary life beside the Nile. Because no matter how large Egypt became, it was still held together by villages like this one. Simple places. Quiet places. Places where families baked bread, repaired tools, raised children, and watched the river carry sunlight across the land. Farther out upon the Nile, the fisherman carefully lowered his net into the water. The evening air felt cooler now. Small ripples spread outward beneath the boat while birds circled overhead searching for places to rest before nightfall. In the distance, another vessel drifted slowly south carrying jars and woven baskets stacked carefully beneath linen coverings. The fisherman paused for a moment and looked toward the village shore. From the river, the homes appeared peaceful beneath the fading sunlight. Smoke rose gently into the golden sky. Tiny figures moved between the buildings while palm trees swayed softly in the evening breeze. He had seen this view thousands of times. Still, it never felt unimportant. There was comfort in familiarity. Comfort in repeated days. Comfort in knowing where the river bent, where the fish gathered, where the warm light touched the village walls before sunset. Ancient Egyptian life often moved this way. Slowly. Repeatedly. Like the river itself. Back near the fields, workers finally began leading animals home. Oxen moved heavily along dusty roads while tired farmers carried wooden tools across their shoulders. Their sandals left soft marks in the earth as evening shadows stretched longer around them. Children ran out to meet fathers and older brothers returning from work. One small boy proudly carried a water jar almost too large for him while walking beside his father toward the village. The farmer from the mud brick house smiled faintly as he saw his children waiting near the road. The long day was ending. Soon darkness would return to the Nile Valley. Soon cooking fires would glow warmly behind village walls. Soon tired families would gather beneath the soft evening sky while stars slowly appeared once more above ancient Egypt. And the river would continue flowing quietly beside them all. As the sun lowered toward the western horizon, the entire village changed color. Golden light spread across the mud brick homes and narrow roads. Palm trees stretched long dark shadows over the earth. The Nile reflected soft orange and red light like moving fire beneath the calm evening sky. This was one of the quietest moments of the day. The hardest labor had ended. The fields rested. And families slowly gathered together again. The farmer returned home carrying his wooden tools across tired shoulders. Dust clung to his legs and sandals after many hours spent beneath the sun. His hands felt rough from rope, soil, and plow handles. But now the air was cooler. The evening breeze moving from the river felt soft against his skin. As he approached the small mud brick house near the edge of the village, he could already smell bread baking inside. Smoke drifted gently from the cooking fire while warm light flickered through the doorway. His children ran to greet him. The younger boy held tightly to his father's leg while the older daughter proudly showed a small basket she had finished weaving beside her mother earlier that afternoon. The farmer smiled quietly and stepped inside. The room glowed softly from the fire. The mother knelt beside flat loaves of bread resting near the clay oven while a pot of lentils simmered slowly nearby. Beside it lay onions, dates, and a small fish caught earlier from the Nile. The meal was simple. Most meals in Egyptian villages were. But after a full day of labor, even plain food carried comfort. The family sat together on woven reed mats near the low fire. Outside, evening sounds drifted softly through the village. Neighbors speaking quietly. Goats shifting inside small pens. Children laughing somewhere farther down the road. The distant splash of water near the riverbank. No one rushed the evening meal. After long hours of work, families often lingered together while daylight slowly faded beyond the village walls. These moments mattered deeply because they were among the few peaceful hours when everyone rested in the same place. The farmer tore pieces of warm bread and dipped them slowly into the lentils. His children ate sleepily beside him while the mother quietly poured water from a clay jar into small cups. Oil lamps flickered gently against the mud brick walls. Smoke from the cooking fire drifted upward through a small opening near the roof. The room felt warm, safe, familiar. Outside, more villagers gathered near their homes as darkness slowly approached. Some sat beside doorways speaking softly about the harvest, the river level, or small news brought by travelers passing through nearby towns. Others repaired fishing nets, sharpened tools, or finished weaving baskets before night fully arrived. An old grandmother rested on a stool beneath the evening sky while telling stories to several children gathered around her feet. She spoke slowly, her voice soft and steady. She described floods from years long past when the Nile rose so high that boats floated close beside the village homes. She spoke about crocodiles seen farther south along the river. She described bright festivals in larger towns where music echoed through temple streets beneath hanging lanterns. The children listened quietly while evening deepened around them. Stories carried warmth during these hours. They connected old memories to younger generations. They helped pass village life forward through time. Farther along the riverbank, fishermen returned slowly with the last light of day. Their boats drifted toward shore carrying folded nets and baskets filled with fish shining silver beneath the fading sunlight. Water slapped gently against the wooden sides while birds circled overhead before disappearing into the darkening reeds. The fisherman from earlier stepped carefully onto shore and pulled his boat onto wet sand beside the village. His back ached. His hands smelled of rope and river water. But tonight the fishing had been good. And that meant his family would eat well. Nearby, several women filled clay jars with fresh water from the Nile before darkness made the work harder. They balanced the heavy jars carefully upon their shoulders and heads while walking slowly back toward the village paths. The sky above Egypt now glowed deep orange near the horizon. Soon the stars would appear. Soon the desert beyond the fields would grow cold again beneath the night sky. And slowly, little by little, the village prepared itself for rest once more. The farmer finished eating and stepped outside his home. The evening breeze moved gently through the road between houses. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward into the darkening sky while small oil lamps began glowing inside nearby homes. He looked toward the Nile. The river seemed darker now, calm beneath the fading light. Somewhere far away, another village rested beside the same water. And beyond that village stood another. And another. Thousands of families across ancient Egypt were ending their days in almost the same quiet way, eating bread beside small fires, speaking softly beneath the stars, and preparing for sleep before another sunrise beside the Nile. Little by little, darkness settled over the village. The final colors of sunset faded slowly from the western sky until only deep blue remained above the Nile. Palm trees became dark shapes against the evening horizon. The fields beyond the homes disappeared into shadow while cool air drifted gently across the land. The heat of the day was finally gone. For many villagers, night brought the most peaceful hours. Work became quieter. Voices softened. The world seemed to breathe more slowly beneath the stars. Inside the small mud brick house near the edge of the village, the family prepared for sleep. The cooking fire had burned low now, glowing softly beneath a layer of gray ash. Clay bowls from the evening meal rested neatly beside the wall waiting to be washed in the morning. The mother folded linen cloth carefully while the children sat sleepily nearby. The younger boy leaned against his sister's shoulder, struggling to keep his eyes open. The older girl traced shapes in the dirt floor with one finger while listening to the quiet sounds outside. Somewhere nearby, a flute played softly for a few brief moments. Then silence returned again. Music in Egyptian villages was usually simple and gentle. During festivals there could be drums, singing, and dancing, but on ordinary evenings the sounds remained calm. A single flute, a soft voice, the rhythm of hands against woven reeds, or quiet songs sung to children before sleep. The father sat near the doorway looking out toward the night sky. Above the village, stars had begun appearing one by one. They looked bright and endless over Egypt. Without large fires or crowded cities nearby, the heavens stretched clearly across the darkness. The villagers often knew the stars well. Farmers watched the sky for signs connected to seasons and flooding. Boatmen used the stars to guide themselves along the river at night. And many families simply found comfort in looking upward after long days of labor. The stars remained steady even when life felt difficult. Outside, the village roads had become mostly empty. A few neighbors still sat together speaking softly beneath the cool night air. An elderly man slowly walked home carrying a small oil lamp whose flame flickered against the darkness. Dogs moved quietly between the homes searching for scraps of food near cooking fires. Farther away near the riverbank, fishermen tied their boats securely for the night. The Nile itself looked almost black beneath the stars. Only small lines of silver moonlight moved gently across the water's surface. Reeds along the shore whispered softly in the breeze while insects hummed steadily through the darkness. The river never truly slept. Even at night, it continued its endless movement through Egypt, carrying boats, fish, reeds, and stories from one place to another. A young mother from another nearby house climbed slowly onto her rooftop carrying her sleeping child in her arms. During warmer seasons, many villagers preferred sleeping outside beneath the open sky where cooler air moved more freely. Rooftops became quiet resting places filled with soft whispers, drifting wind, and distant sounds from the river. The woman laid the child carefully upon a woven mat and sat beside him for a moment. Above her, the stars looked close enough to touch. The night smelled faintly of dust, river water, smoke, and dry reeds. In the distance, jackals cried somewhere beyond the fields near the desert edge. The sound faded quickly back into silence. Ancient Egypt could feel both peaceful and enormous during the night. The villages themselves were small islands of light beside the endless darkness of the desert and sky. Beyond the cultivated land stretched vast empty spaces where travelers crossed beneath moonlight and cold winds moved across the sand dunes. Most villagers rarely entered those distant deserts. Their lives belonged to the river, to the fields, to the narrow roads between familiar homes. Still, the desert remained close enough to remind them how fragile life beside the Nile truly was. Without the river's water, everything green would disappear. And so each village rested carefully beside the ancient current that protected it from the surrounding emptiness. Inside the small house, the family finally prepared to sleep. The mother spread linen coverings across the reed mats. The children curled beside one another, already half dreaming after the long warm day. The father lowered the oil lamp flame until only faint light remained within the room. Outside, the village became quieter still. One by one, voices disappeared. One by one, doorways darkened. The old grandmother who had told stories earlier now rested peacefully upon her rooftop beneath the stars. The fishermen slept beside folded nets still smelling faintly of the river. Farmers stretched tired bodies across mats while warm night air drifted through small windows and open doorways. Above them all, the sky remained enormous and calm. Hours passed slowly. The Nile continued flowing through darkness. A soft breeze crossed the fields where crops waited silently for another sunrise. Boats rocked gently against wooden posts near the shore. Palm leaves rustled quietly beneath the moonlight. And through the peaceful night, ancient Egyptian village life rested beside the river, preparing once again for another day that would begin with birds calling softly before dawn. Not every season beside the Nile looked the same. As the months slowly passed, the river itself began to change. Far to the south, beyond the villages and temples known to most ordinary Egyptians, heavy rains fell across distant lands. Those rains slowly fed the great river until the Nile rose higher and higher, carrying dark rich water northward through Egypt. For the villagers, this season mattered more than almost anything else. Because the flood brought life. One morning, long after many ordinary days of farming beneath the sun, the villagers noticed the river climbing steadily against the banks. Water crept farther into the canals. The current moved stronger than before, carrying reeds, branches, and dark soil along its surface. The flood season had begun. The farmer from the small mud brick house stood beside several neighbors near the riverbank watching the rising water carefully. No one looked frightened. This was expected. This was necessary. For generations beyond memory, Egyptian families had depended upon these yearly floods. When the Nile spread across the land, it left behind thick black soil rich enough to grow strong crops once the water finally withdrew again. Without flooding, the earth would weaken. Harvests would shrink. Hunger could come quietly into the villages. And so the arrival of flood water often carried a feeling of deep relief. The villagers watched calmly while sunlight reflected across the rising river. Children stood nearby whispering excitedly while older men pointed toward floating reeds drifting past in the stronger current. Women carried water jars along the shore while discussing how high the flood might rise this year. Every family paid attention. A strong flood meant healthy fields. But too much water could damage homes, canals, and storage areas near the riverbank. So the villagers prepared carefully. Over the following days, the Nile continued spreading outward across low fields near the village. Water filled irrigation canals until they overflowed gently into surrounding farmland. The earth became soft and dark beneath the bright Egyptian sky. The smell of wet soil spread across the entire valley. It was a rich smell. Heavy and alive. The farmer walked slowly through shallow water covering part of his field while checking wooden markers placed earlier beside the canal edges. Nearby, other villagers strengthened barriers with mud and bundled reeds to guide the flood water safely where it was needed most. Children followed along the edges of flooded land watching tiny fish swim through water now covering places that had been dry only weeks before. Birds gathered everywhere during flood season. White birds stood quietly in shallow water searching for insects stirred up by the rising Nile. Others circled above the fields while frogs croaked loudly from flooded canals during the evening hours. The whole landscape changed. Fields disappeared beneath water. Boats traveled across places where people had walked before. The river seemed wider, stronger, and more alive than during dry months. For farmers, flood season also brought a different rhythm of work. Some farming tasks paused while the land remained underwater. During these weeks, villagers often repaired tools, mended homes, wove baskets, cleaned storage jars, or helped with larger building projects organized within nearby towns. Life slowed in some ways. But it never fully stopped. Inside the village, the mother spent long afternoons repairing linen clothing beside the doorway while flood water shimmered beyond the homes in the distance. Her daughter sat nearby learning more careful weaving patterns from an older neighbor. The younger boy often wandered toward the riverbank with other children to watch boats moving through newly widened channels. The flood fascinated him. Water now covered parts of the land where he had once run barefoot through dry fields. Fish flashed silver through shallow pools left behind near the canals. The river felt larger than ever before. One evening, the family climbed together onto their rooftop to escape the lingering warmth trapped inside the house after sunset. From above, the floodplain reflected moonlight in long silver shapes stretching beside the village. The Nile looked enormous beneath the stars. The father pointed quietly toward the dark water while explaining how the floods fed the earth year after year. His children listened carefully. One day they too would depend upon this river. One day they would measure seasons not by numbers, but by rising water, planting time, harvest winds, and the movement of the Nile beneath the Egyptian sun. Farther along the riverbank, fishermen adapted easily to the flood season. Their boats now moved across wider waters where fish traveled through flooded canals and fields. Nets filled differently during these weeks, and experienced fishermen understood exactly where to search. The old fisherman from the village guided his boat quietly through water covering what had once been farmland. Palm trees rose from the flood like dark islands beneath the evening sky while frogs called loudly from every direction. He had seen many flood seasons during his life. Some generous, some weak, some frighteningly high. But each one reminded the villagers again that Egypt belonged to the Nile more than to any king, temple, or city. The river ruled everything. And the people shaped their lives around its endless breathing rhythm, rising, spreading, retreating, and returning once more. As the flood season continued, the world around the village became softer. The dry roads that once carried workers into the fields now ended beneath shallow water and dark mud. Small canals overflowed quietly into the land. Reflections of palm trees shimmered across flooded earth while boats drifted slowly through places where children had played only months before. Everywhere, the Nile could be seen. Everywhere, its presence could be felt. Morning sunlight now rose across wide sheets of water surrounding the village. Birds gathered in great numbers beside the flooded fields, their long legs moving carefully through the shallow pools. Frogs croaked loudly during cool dawn hours, and insects buzzed constantly above the wet earth. The village itself remained safe upon slightly higher ground. Its mud brick homes stood together beneath the bright sky while the river spread peacefully around them like a second world of moving silver and black soil. Inside the small house near the edge of the village, the family woke once again before sunrise. The rhythm of life had changed slightly during flood season, but mornings still began quietly. The mother rose first and prepared grain for bread while soft blue light entered through the doorway. The father stepped outside and breathed the cool damp air drifting from the flooded fields nearby. The smell was different now. Not dry dust and hot earth, but wet soil, river water, fresh mud, the scent of new life waiting beneath the flood. In the distance, fishermen were already moving across the water in narrow wooden boats. Their paddles dipped gently into the flood waters while birds circled low above them. The younger boy stepped sleepily outside beside his father and stared across the shimmering landscape. The world looked enormous to him during flood season. Water stretched far beyond the village edges, reflecting the pale colors of dawn beneath the sky. Small islands of higher ground rose from the floodplain with clusters of reeds and palm trees standing quietly upon them. The boy pointed toward a drifting boat in the distance. His father smiled faintly and placed one rough hand upon the child's shoulder. For children, flood season often felt magical. The familiar world changed shape completely. New sounds filled the air. New paths opened across the water. Even ordinary reflections of sunlight dancing across flooded fields could hold their attention for long quiet moments. As daylight strengthened, the village slowly became active once again. Women carried water jars carefully through muddy roads. Men repaired fishing nets beneath woven shade coverings. Older boys helped guide small boats tied near the village edge while younger children searched for fish trapped in shallow pools left behind beside canals. Without constant field labor during the highest floods, some families finally had brief moments to rest aching bodies worn down by long farming seasons. But there was always work of another kind waiting nearby. The farmers spent much of the season helping strengthen canal walls and storage buildings. Floodwater could damage mud brick structures if left unchecked, so villagers repaired weak places carefully using fresh clay, reeds, and straw. Nearby, groups of men worked together carrying heavy baskets of wet mud to reinforce canal edges before water rose farther. Their feet sank deeply into soft ground. Mud covered their legs and sandals. Yet no one complained loudly. This labor protected the village itself. And so the work continued steadily beneath the Egyptian sun. Farther along the flooded fields, women gathered reeds growing thick beside the water's edge. The reeds would later become baskets, mats, roof coverings, sandals, and many other useful objects inside the village. A gentle breeze moved through the tall green plants while the women worked quietly together. Birdsong drifted across the floodplain. The Nile sparkled brightly beneath the morning light. In many ways, flood season brought beauty to the land. The harsh dryness of Egypt softened beneath water and green growth. Fish became more plentiful. Birds filled the skies and wetlands. The earth itself seemed refreshed after months beneath the burning sun. Even the evenings felt cooler and calmer. At sunset, villagers often gathered near the water to watch the fading light spread across the flooded fields. Children skipped stones through shallow pools while older men sat together discussing the height of the river compared to earlier years. One evening, the old fisherman rested beside his boat watching the sky slowly darken over the Nile. The floodwaters moved gently around reeds near the shore. Insects hummed steadily while distant voices drifted from the village behind him. He remembered flood seasons from his childhood. Back then, he had sat beside his own father listening to stories about the river while warm wind crossed the water at dusk. Now many years had passed. His hair had turned gray. His hands had become rough and worn. But the Nile remained the same. Always moving. Always returning. Always feeding the land. The fisherman dipped one hand into the cool flood water and watched the ripples spread outward beneath the evening sky. Nearby, a group of children floated small reed toys through a shallow flooded canal while laughing softly together. Their reflections shimmered beside them in the dark water. The old man smiled quietly. Life beside the Nile changed slowly across generations. Children became workers. Workers became elders. Elders disappeared into memory. Yet the river carried everything forward with calm, endless patience. Back inside the village, oil lamps began glowing warmly inside homes as darkness approached once more. The mother finished preparing the evening meal while her daughter folded linen cloth near the doorway. The younger boy sat listening to his father speak about planting season that would arrive once the flood waters finally retreated. Soon the rich black soil would appear again. Soon the plows would return to the fields. Soon another cycle of labor would begin beside the Nile. But for now, the land still rested beneath water and moonlight. And through the peaceful Egyptian night, the flood season continued quietly around the sleeping village. Several weeks into the flood season, a boat arrived from farther down the Nile. The villagers noticed it early in the morning while pale mist still floated above the water. Unlike the smaller fishing boats tied near the village shore, this vessel carried a cloth covering stretched above part of its deck to protect goods and travelers from the sun. It moved slowly through the flood water toward the village landing area. Children spotted it first. Soon word spread quietly between the homes. A visitor had arrived. Travelers were not uncommon along the Nile. Merchants, messengers, priests, fishermen, laborers, and officials often moved between villages using the river as Egypt's great road. Yet each arrival still brought small moments of curiosity to places where daily life remained deeply familiar and repetitive. The boat finally touched the muddy shore beside the reeds. A thin man dressed in clean linen stepped carefully onto the land carrying a wooden case beneath one arm. Behind him, another worker unloaded small baskets and clay jars from the boat. The thin man was a scribe. The villagers recognized him quickly by the tools he carried. Inside his wooden case rested brushes made from reeds, small cakes of black and red ink, and neatly rolled sheets of papyrus waiting for writing. Few people inside ordinary farming villages could read or write, and because of that, scribes often seemed important and distant to many families beside the Nile. Writing itself felt almost magical. Symbols painted carefully across papyrus could carry names, numbers, prayers, tax records, or messages between cities far apart along the river. The scribe walked calmly toward the center of the village while several children followed him quietly at a distance. The younger boy from the mud brick house stared wide-eyed at the wooden writing case swinging gently beneath the man's arm. He had seen scribes before, but not often. Most village children grew up expecting lives connected to farming, fishing, weaving, pottery, or labor beside the Nile. Scribes belonged to another world, a world of records, temples, officials, and knowledge carried through painted symbols. Near the village center, several elders greeted the visitor respectfully. The scribe spoke softly and explained that he had come to count grain storage, inspect flood levels, and record information for officials in a larger town farther north. Such visits were part of ordinary Egyptian life. The kingdom depended upon careful records. Grain harvests, taxes, canal repairs, labor duties, and flood measurements were all written down by trained scribes working for temples or government officials. Without writing, managing such a large kingdom along the Nile would have been nearly impossible. The villagers listened quietly while the scribe prepared his tools beneath a shaded area beside one of the larger homes. He sat upon a low stool and carefully unrolled a sheet of pale papyrus. Then he opened small containers of ink and sharpened the tip of a reed brush with a knife. The children watched in complete silence. The brush moved lightly across the papyrus surface, creating rows of dark symbols with smooth practiced movements. The marks looked beautiful to those who could not read them: tiny birds, curved lines, human shapes, and strange patterns flowing carefully across the page. The younger boy stepped slightly closer for a better look. The scribe noticed him and smiled faintly without pausing his work. For a moment, the boy imagined what it might feel like to understand those mysterious symbols. To place words onto papyrus. To carry knowledge between villages along the river. But soon another sound distracted him. Nearby, fishermen had returned with fresh catches from the flood waters, and villagers gathered beside the shore to help unload the boats. Life continued moving around the visitor exactly as before. Women still baked bread. Workers still repaired canals. Children still chased one another through muddy roads beside the flooded fields. The scribe simply became another small part of the village rhythm for a short time. Throughout the afternoon, he moved carefully between storage buildings and flooded fields, recording measurements and counting supplies. Sometimes he paused to speak with village elders about canal conditions or expected planting seasons once the waters receded. His writing remained calm and precise. Nothing was rushed. Every mark upon the papyrus mattered. As evening approached, the scribe finally rested beside the riverbank, watching golden sunlight spread across the floodplain. The village children still watched him curiously from nearby. One little girl asked softly whether all the symbols were difficult to learn. The scribe looked toward the glowing water before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "Very difficult." Then he smiled again and added, "But beautiful too." The children considered his words seriously while warm evening wind moved through the reeds around them. Far across the flooded land, birds drifted through the orange sky while the Nile reflected the final light of day. And beside the river, the quiet village settled once more into another peaceful Egyptian evening. Slowly, almost without notice, the flood waters began to retreat. Day after day, the Nile pulled gently back toward its deeper channels, leaving behind wide stretches of dark black earth shining beneath the Egyptian sun. The flooded fields slowly emerged once more from the water, soft and rich with fresh soil carried from far to the south. For the villagers, this was one of the most important moments of the year. The planting season had arrived. Early one morning, before the sun had fully risen above the horizon, the farmer from the small mud brick house stepped outside and looked toward the fields. Mist floated low over the damp earth. The smell of wet soil filled the cool morning air. Birds moved through the newly uncovered land searching for insects and seeds left behind by the flood waters. Small pools still reflected pale dawn light between the furrows where water had not yet fully disappeared. The farmer stood quietly for a moment. Then he gathered his tools. Across the village, many others were doing the same thing. The peaceful, slower rhythm of flood season had ended. Now the long cycle of work would begin again. Every family understood the importance of these coming weeks. Seeds had to be planted carefully into the rich soil before the stronger heat returned later in the season. The success of the next harvest depended on these early days. Inside the house, the mother prepared bread for the workers while her daughter folded linen cloth and filled water jars for the journey to the fields. The younger boy rubbed sleep from his eyes while watching the village slowly wake around him. Outside, the roads became busy again. Oxen were led toward the fields. Wooden plows scraped softly against the earth. Workers carried baskets filled with seed grain carefully saved from earlier harvests. The whole village seemed to move outward toward the newly revealed land beside the Nile. As sunlight spread across the valley, the fields glowed dark and fertile beneath the brightening sky. The soil left behind by the flood was soft beneath sandals, almost black in color compared to the pale desert beyond. This rich earth was the great gift of the Nile. Without it, Egypt could never have supported so many villages, farms, and cities. The farmer guided his oxen slowly through the damp field while the wooden plow cut deep lines into the softened ground. Behind him, another worker scattered seeds carefully into the open furrows. Barley, wheat, flax, lentils. Every handful mattered. Birds followed close behind searching for easy food among the freshly turned soil. Children ran through nearby fields chasing them away with laughter and waving arms so the seeds would remain protected. The younger boy proudly joined the older children, though he often became distracted watching frogs leap between muddy puddles left behind by the flood waters. Nearby, women worked alongside the men carrying baskets, repairing irrigation channels, and preparing food beneath small shade coverings placed near the fields. Planting season required the effort of nearly everyone. The days became long again. But there was hope in the work. Fresh soil meant possibility. Strong planting meant future bread. Future safety. Future life for the village. The sun climbed steadily higher above Egypt. Warm light reflected from damp earth while insects buzzed softly through the air. Water still moved gently through irrigation canals connecting the fields to the Nile. Workers paused occasionally to drink from cool clay jars wrapped in wet cloth. Even during busy seasons, life beside the river rarely became hurried. Movements remained steady and practiced. The villagers understood that farming could not be rushed beyond the pace of the earth itself. Seeds needed time. Water needed patience. The land followed its own rhythm beneath the sky. By midday, much of the village echoed with the sounds of planting. Oxen snorted softly while pulling plows. Wood creaked. Birds called across the open fields. Low voices drifted through the warm air as workers spoke quietly beside the canals. The farmer paused and looked across the valley. From where he stood, he could see dozens of other villagers working beneath the bright Egyptian sun. Beyond them stretched more fields, more canals, more distant villages following the same ancient cycle beside the Nile. Everywhere, people planted into the dark soil left behind by the retreating flood. Everywhere, hope rested beneath the earth in the form of tiny buried seeds. Farther away near the village edge, the old fisherman repaired nets beneath the shade of a palm tree. Flood season had been generous this year, and fishing remained good even as the waters withdrew. Small fish still filled the canals and shallow pools left behind near the riverbank. The old man worked slowly, his fingers moving carefully through tangled rope while children gathered nearby to listen to his stories once again. He spoke about earlier planting seasons from long ago. About years when the floods had been weak. About years when harvests had filled every storage room with grain. The children listened while warm wind crossed the fields carrying the smell of wet soil and fresh earth. One little girl asked whether the Nile would ever stop flooding. The fisherman looked toward the shining river before answering. "No," he said softly. "The river remembers its path." The children fell silent for a moment, thinking carefully about his words. As afternoon approached, the planting continued steadily beneath the endless blue sky. The farmer's feet became coated in dark mud. Sweat covered his arms and neck. His oxen moved more slowly now from the long hours of labor. Still, he continued guiding the plow through the rich soil because the work mattered too much to stop early. All around him, the village labored together beside the Nile exactly as countless generations had done before. And beneath the warm Egyptian earth, the future harvest quietly waited to begin growing. While the men worked long hours in the newly planted fields, life inside the village continued with its own quiet rhythm. The narrow roads between the mud brick homes filled with soft sounds from morning until evening, grain being ground into flour, water jars touching stone, woven reeds brushing together, children laughing somewhere in the distance, and cooking fires crackling gently beneath clay ovens. The women of the village carried much of daily life upon their shoulders. Before sunrise each morning, many were already awake. The mother from the small house near the edge of the village rose while the stars still faded above the Nile. The air felt cool during those early hours, and for a few peaceful moments the village remained nearly silent except for distant insects and the quiet movement of river water far away in the darkness. She wrapped light linen cloth around herself and knelt beside the grinding stone. The work began again. Back and forth. Stone against grain. Soft steady movements repeated countless times through the years. Grinding grain was slow and tiring work, but it formed the center of village life. Bread fed the workers in the fields. Bread filled the stomachs of children before sleep. Bread traveled with fishermen onto the Nile and rested beside laborers repairing canals beneath the sun. Without flour, the village could not continue. So every morning the women ground grain patiently before the heat of the day arrived. Nearby, her daughter watched closely while helping separate husks from the wheat. The girl was growing older now. Her hands had become quicker with weaving and household work. Slowly, little by little, she learned the rhythm of village life from her mother. Nothing was taught through long speeches. Children learned by watching. By helping. By repeating the same movements day after day until those movements became natural. As dawn light slowly entered the room, the smell of fresh flour mixed with smoke from the first cooking fires rising outside. Across the village, other women prepared for the day in nearly identical ways. Some baked bread inside clay ovens warmed by glowing coals. Others swept dirt floors with bundles of reeds or carried empty water jars toward the Nile before the roads became crowded. The village slowly awakened around them. A donkey brayed somewhere near the center of the homes. Birds called from the palm trees. Children stepped sleepily outside, rubbing their eyes while warm sunlight touched the mud brick walls. The mother shaped bread dough carefully upon a low wooden surface while her daughter carried water from the storage jar into small clay bowls. Nearby, the younger boy still slept peacefully beneath a linen cloth. The mother smiled faintly at the sight of him. Children rested deeply after long days beneath the Egyptian sun. Once the bread finished baking, the warm smell drifted through the house and out into the narrow road beyond. Neighbors passing nearby recognized the familiar scent immediately. Nearly every home carried it during the early hours of morning. Bread, smoke, warm clay. These smells belonged to Egyptian village life as naturally as the Nile itself. Later in the morning, after the workers had already disappeared into the fields, groups of women gathered near the riverbank carrying bundles of clothing and empty jars. The Nile served the village in many ways beyond farming. Its water cleaned clothing, cooled jars, fed fish into nets, and refreshed tired bodies during the hottest seasons. Women knelt beside smooth stones at the river edge, washing linen garments carefully while speaking softly together. The younger children played nearby among the reeds. Some searched for shells or smooth stones along the muddy shore. Others floated tiny reed boats through shallow water while older sisters watched them carefully. The women talked quietly as they worked. They spoke about planting conditions in the fields, about children growing quickly, about repairs needed for roofs before the next flood season. Their voices mixed gently with splashing water and bird calls drifting across the river. Life moved slowly here. No one hurried the washing. No one rushed the mourning. The Nile continued flowing steadily beside them all. Farther back inside the village, an elderly woman sat beneath a woven shade covering, spinning flax fibers into thread. Her fingers moved with calm precision despite their age. Flax was important throughout Egypt. From it came linen cloth used for clothing, blankets, sails, and wrappings. Families worked carefully to prepare the fibers, spinning them slowly into thread before weaving the material by hand. The old woman's granddaughter sat nearby trying to copy the movements. At first the fibers tangled awkwardly between the child's fingers. But the grandmother only smiled patiently. Skills like these required years. Village life itself was built upon patience. Nothing useful came quickly. Not bread. Not harvests. Not cloth. Not wisdom. Everything grew slowly beside the Nile. As midday approached, the heat returned strongly over the village. Women retreated into shaded rooms where thick mud brick walls protected them from the worst of the sun. Some repaired clothing. Others prepared lentils, onions, beans, or dried fish for the evening meal. Inside the small house, the mother sat near the doorway mending a torn linen garment belonging to her husband. Light from outside touched the floor softly while warm wind drifted through the open entrance. The younger boy now sat awake beside her, carving shapes into a small piece of clay with a stick. His sister continued weaving reeds into another basket, her movements becoming more confident each day. The mother looked at her children quietly. Life beside the Nile could be difficult. Floods sometimes failed. Heat exhausted the body. Food had to be protected carefully between harvests. Yet there was comfort in the small repeated rhythms of ordinary days. Children learning beside their parents. Bread baking in the mornings. Cool evening air after sunset. The sound of river water moving through darkness. These simple things shaped the heart of village life more deeply than kings or temples far away. Outside, sunlight burned bright across the planted fields where the men still worked beside the canals. And inside the cool mud brick homes, the women of the village quietly held daily life together, one careful task at a time. Every few weeks, the peaceful rhythm of the village changed slightly. Boats began appearing more frequently along the Nile. Travelers walked dusty roads carrying bundles across their shoulders. Voices grew louder near the riverbank as nearby villages gathered for trade beside the water. It was market day. Long before sunrise, movement had already begun near the shore. The farmer from the small mud brick house stepped outside while stars still glimmered faintly above the Nile. Today he would travel with several others to a larger riverside market not far from the village. Beside him, his wife carefully wrapped bread, onions, and dried fish inside linen cloth for the journey. Nearby rested several baskets woven by their daughter and a small sack of grain to exchange for other goods. Trade connected even the quietest Egyptian villages to the larger world beyond them. Most families produced many things themselves: bread, baskets, cloth, tools, and pottery, but markets still mattered deeply. There, villagers exchanged extra grain, fish, reeds, linen, oils, animals, and crafted goods for items they could not easily make at home. The younger boy watched excitedly as the baskets were loaded into a small boat tied beside the shore. Market days felt special to children. The river became busier. New faces appeared. Strange accents and unfamiliar stories drifted through the air. As dawn slowly brightened the sky, the boat pushed away from the muddy bank and drifted southward along the Nile. Mist floated gently above the water while palm trees and reeds passed quietly along the shore. Other boats traveled nearby carrying pottery, vegetables, fish, or jars of oil toward the same destination. The river looked alive this morning. Birds crossed low over the water. Voices echoed softly between boats. Sunlight slowly spread across the Nile Valley, turning the surface of the river pale gold beneath the growing day. The farmer sat quietly near the front of the boat watching the familiar landscape drift past. Villages appeared and disappeared beside the riverbanks, clusters of mud brick homes, palm trees, canals, and small fields stretching outward from the Nile into the green fertile land. Beyond the cultivated earth waited the pale desert, silent beneath the morning sky. After several hours, the market settlement finally appeared ahead. It rested beside a wider section of the river where boats gathered near wooden docks and muddy shorelines crowded with people. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward into the warm air while voices blended together into a constant low murmur. For villagers used to quieter roads and smaller gatherings, the market could feel busy and almost overwhelming. Still, its rhythm remained calmer than the crowded cities farther north. Boats bumped gently beside one another as goods were unloaded onto the shore. Men carried sacks of grain across their backs while women arranged baskets, vegetables, pottery, and woven cloth upon reed mats spread across the ground. The smell of bread, fish, oil, animals, river mud, and warm dust filled the air. The farmer stepped carefully through the market carrying the baskets made by his daughter. Nearby, traders from other villages displayed jars of honey, dried dates, herbs, sandals, fishing hooks, and painted pottery. A man farther down the shore sold small carved wooden figures while another sharpened bronze knives beneath a shade covering. Children moved everywhere through the crowd, following parents, or staring curiously at unfamiliar objects brought from distant places along the Nile. The younger boy stayed close beside his father, wide-eyed with wonder. He watched a merchant unload brightly colored cloth from a larger river boat. Nearby, another trader showed tiny glass beads shimmering blue beneath the sunlight. To the child, the market felt enormous. So many voices. So many smells. So many strange faces moving beside the river. Yet even here, the Nile remained at the center of everything. Boats arrived constantly carrying goods from one village to another. Fishermen sold fresh catches directly beside the shore. Water jars cooled in the river while traders rested in the shade during the hottest hours of the day. The river connected every conversation, every trade, every journey. Without it, none of this movement would exist. By midday, the heat grew stronger over the crowded market. Many traders rested beneath woven coverings while eating bread and drinking water from clay jars. The farmer sat quietly beside his son near the riverbank sharing a simple meal while watching boats drift slowly through the sunlight. Nearby, musicians played soft flute music beneath a shade canopy while several children danced lazily through the dust. The market felt alive in a quiet, peaceful way. Not loud or hurried. Just full of movement. Full of ordinary human life beside the Nile. As afternoon slowly passed, the farmer finished his trading and prepared for the journey home. The baskets had been exchanged successfully for oil, fresh tools, and a small amount of cloth his wife had wanted for many months. The younger boy carried a tiny carved wooden bird given to him by an old merchant near the docks. He held it carefully during the boat ride back toward the village. As sunset approached, the Nile glowed orange beneath the evening sky while the market slowly disappeared behind them in the distance. Ahead, their quiet village waited once more beside the river. Several days after the market journey, the air began to change. At first, the villagers noticed only small signs. The morning breeze felt warmer than usual. Birds moved lower across the fields. The distant horizon beyond the western desert looked pale and strangely blurred beneath the sunlight. The old fisherman noticed it while repairing nets beside the Nile. He paused for a moment and stared toward the desert edge. Then he quietly said to another villager, "The wind is coming." In Egypt, the desert never felt far away. Even beside the green fertile land of the Nile Valley, people remained surrounded by endless dry sands stretching beyond the horizon. Most days, the river protected village life from that harsh emptiness. But sometimes the desert reminded everyone of its presence. By midday, the wind had strengthened. Warm air moved steadily through the village roads, carrying fine grains of sand that brushed softly against skin and clothing. Palm leaves rattled loudly overhead while the Nile itself became rougher beneath the growing gusts. The farmer looked upward from the fields. The sky no longer seemed clear blue. A pale dusty haze slowly spread across the sunlight. Workers began gathering tools more quickly now. Women outside the homes hurried to bring baskets, cloth, and pottery indoors before stronger winds arrived. Children watched nervously while older villagers moved with calm, familiar experience. They had seen storms before. Far across the desert, winds were lifting great clouds of sand into the air and pushing them slowly toward the Nile Valley. By afternoon, the storm reached the village. The sky turned dull and yellow-gray. Sunlight faded behind blowing dust until the world looked strangely dim even though it was still daytime. Wind rushed through the narrow roads between houses carrying sand against walls, doors, animals, and faces. The sound filled everything. Soft scraping. Whistling air. Palm branches shaking violently overhead. The mother quickly covered storage jars and food baskets with linen cloth while her daughter closed the wooden shutters near the doorway. Fine dust still slipped through every small crack in the mud brick walls. The younger boy sat close beside his father listening to the storm outside. Sandstorms could last for hours. Sometimes longer. Outside, visibility became difficult. The fields disappeared behind blowing dust while even nearby homes looked faded and distant through the thick air. Workers returning from the fields wrapped cloth tightly around their mouths and heads as they pushed against the wind toward the village. The farmer finally entered the house carrying his tools. Sand coated his shoulders and arms. His eyes looked tired from squinting against the storm. The mother handed him water while the wind continued roaring softly outside the walls. Inside the small home, the family waited together. The room had grown darker now. Fine dust drifted slowly through beams of weak sunlight slipping between cracks near the roof. The cooking fire burned low and steady, its warmth mixing with the dry smell of sand filling the air. The younger boy listened carefully to the storm sounds beyond the doorway. To him, it almost sounded like the desert itself breathing around the village. Outside, animals huddled close against walls and fences. Boats tied along the Nile shore pulled hard against their ropes while waves slapped roughly against muddy banks. The old fisherman remained inside his own home repairing rope by lamplight while dust scratched softly against the walls outside. He remembered storms from childhood that had lasted nearly 2 full days. During those times, the world beyond the village disappeared completely behind moving sand. Yet eventually the wind always passed. And the Nile remained. As afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the storm finally began weakening. The air still carried dust, but the strongest winds faded little by little. Villagers cautiously stepped outside their homes and looked around at the changed landscape. Thin layers of sand covered roads, rooftops, and baskets left outside too long. Palm fronds lay scattered across the ground. Small dunes had formed beside walls and fences where the wind pushed drifting sand into corners. The sky slowly brightened again. Faint orange sunlight appeared through the dusty haze near the western horizon. The farmer stood outside his home beside several neighbors. No one spoke loudly. Storms always left people feeling quieter afterward. The air smelled dry and strange after so many hours of blowing desert sand. Yet beneath that smell still rested something familiar, the scent of river water drifting softly from the Nile nearby. The river had endured the storm calmly. It always did. Even now, as evening approached, the Nile continued moving through the valley exactly as before while small waves reflected the returning light of sunset. Children slowly emerged from the homes once more. The younger boy ran excitedly through the village pointing at the strange shapes the wind had made in the sand beside the walls. Other children laughed while drawing lines and circles through the fresh dust coating the ground. Life returned quickly after the storm. Women swept sand from doorways and cooking areas. Men checked boats, tools, and animal shelters for damage. Smoke rose once again from evening cooking fires while the village settled slowly back into its familiar rhythm. As darkness arrived, the air became calm and cool. The sky cleared completely, revealing countless stars above the Nile Valley. After hours of dust and wind, the night felt especially peaceful. The family from the small mud brick house climbed together onto the rooftop after their evening meal. The younger boy lay upon a woven mat staring upward at the enormous sky while warm night wind moved gently across the village. Below them, the Nile reflected moonlight quietly between the dark river banks. The storm already felt distant now. The desert had spoken for a few hours and then fallen silent again. And beside the ancient river, the village returned once more to its calm endless rhythm beneath the stars. The morning after the storm, the village woke beneath clear skies. Fresh sunlight spread across the mud brick homes and newly swept roads while the Nile shimmered peacefully beside the green fields. Palm trees stood still again after yesterday's violent wind, and only small piles of sand beside walls and doorways remained as reminders of the storm. Life resumed quietly. The farmer returned to the fields early with the other workers. Women baked bread and carried water from the river. Children wandered between homes chasing one another through the cool morning dust. And near the center of the village, the potter began his work. His workshop stood beside a narrow road shaded partly by woven reed coverings tied above wooden poles. Rows of finished clay jars rested carefully outside in the sunlight, their smooth surfaces glowing warm red and brown beneath the Egyptian sky. Some jars were large enough to store grain for months. Others were small cups, bowls, or oil containers shaped for daily use inside village homes. Pottery existed everywhere in Egyptian life. Water rested inside clay jars. Bread dough rose in clay bowls. Fish cooked in clay pots above small fires. Even the poorest families depended on pottery every single day. The potter sat quietly beside his wheel while soft morning light touched the ground around him. Near his feet rested damp clay gathered earlier from the Nile banks. The river provided more than water and fertile soil. Its mud itself became useful. The potter pressed both hands gently into the wet clay and began shaping it slowly. Round and round the wheel turned. His fingers moved with calm confidence earned through years of repetition. The clay rose gradually beneath his touch, becoming taller, thinner, smoother. A jar slowly appeared where moments before there had only been shapeless earth. The potter's young son watched carefully nearby. He always watched. The boy already knew many small tasks: carrying water, preparing clay, cleaning tools, moving finished pottery into sunlight for drying. But the true shaping still belonged to his father. For now, the potter understood that one day those skilled hands would become old and slow. And when that time arrived, the work would pass naturally to the next generation, just as it had passed to him from his own father many years earlier. Village life flowed this way beside the Nile. Quiet knowledge moved from parent to child through daily work rather than written lessons. The potter paused for a moment and lifted the nearly finished jar carefully from the wheel. Its surface still glistened with moisture. Nearby, several completed bowls rested in the sun, drying before they would later be hardened in a hot clay kiln outside the village. The younger boy from the small mud brick house wandered into the workshop carrying his little carved wooden bird from the market. He loved watching the potter work. There was something peaceful about it. The slow spinning wheel. The wet clay moving beneath steady fingers. The silence broken only by soft scraping sounds and distant birds calling near the river. The potter smiled faintly at the child and handed him a tiny piece of leftover clay. The boy immediately began shaping it with serious concentration while sitting upon the dusty ground nearby. His fingers pressed awkwardly into the soft material, creating something uneven that might one day become a small animal or bowl. The potter said nothing. He simply continued working while sunlight slowly climbed higher above the village. Outside the workshop, ordinary life moved steadily onward. Women passed carrying water jars balanced gracefully upon their heads. Farmers disappeared toward the fields beyond the canals. Goats wandered beside fences nibbling dry plants growing near the roads. The smell of bread drifted softly through the warm morning air. By midday, the heat strengthened once again across the village. The potter moved his work deeper beneath the shade covering where cooler air still lingered. His son arranged finished jars carefully along the wall while trying not to drop any. Each piece mattered. Good pottery took time and labor. A broken jar could mean wasted grain, spilled water, or lost oil for a family already living carefully from season to season. The potter often traded his work during market days along the Nile. Sometimes he exchanged jars directly for grain, fish, cloth, or tools. Other times he worked for neighboring families who paid him after harvest seasons. Money mattered less here than usefulness. A strong jar held value because it protected food and water. A good bowl mattered because families used it every day. Everything in village life remained closely connected to survival. As afternoon approached, warm wind drifted lazily through the workshop carrying the smell of wet clay and river mud. The younger boy had finally shaped his tiny piece of clay into something almost resembling a bird. Crooked, uneven, but still recognizable. The potter looked at it carefully before nodding with quiet approval. The child smiled proudly. Outside, sunlight glowed against the mud brick walls while the Nile continued moving softly beyond the village. And beneath the peaceful Egyptian sky, the potter's hands continued shaping earth into objects that would become part of daily life beside the river for many years to come. The days continued passing gently beside the Nile. Planting season slowly settled into routine once more. The fields began showing thin green shoots rising carefully from the rich black soil left behind by the flood waters. Irrigation canals carried fresh river water between the growing crops while farmers watched the young plants with quiet hope. Everywhere, life moved forward slowly. Morning followed night. Heat followed dawn. And evening always returned at the end of the long laboring day. One evening, after many hours spent beneath the sun, the villagers gathered near the center of the village beside several cooking fires glowing warmly in the fading light. The air felt softer now. Cooler. A light breeze moved through the palm trees while smoke drifted upward toward the darkening sky. The farmer from the small mud brick house sat beside his family upon woven reed mats spread across the ground. Nearby, neighbors rested after work while children wandered sleepily between the fires. Someone began playing a flute. The sound floated gently through the evening air, soft and slow like the movement of the Nile itself. The music did not feel grand or complicated. It was simple, repeating, peaceful. Yet everyone listened. Music belonged quietly to village life. Most days were too busy for long celebrations. Workers returned tired from the fields. Women spent hours preparing food and repairing household items. Children helped with endless small tasks around the homes. But during calm evenings like this one, music sometimes rose softly between the houses while the stars appeared overhead. An elderly woman began humming along with the flute. Soon another voice joined her. The song moved slowly, carried by memory more than performance. It spoke of the river, of planting seasons, of birds rising above the floodplain during dawn. The younger children grew quiet while listening. The firelight flickered gently across their faces. The younger boy leaned against his father's shoulder watching sparks drift upward into the darkening sky. Nearby, the old fisherman sat repairing part of a net while listening to the music with tired, peaceful eyes. His hands continued moving automatically through the rope even while the song filled the evening around him. He had heard many songs during his life. Some joyful. Some sorrowful. Some almost forgotten now except for small fragments still resting in memory like distant echoes. This one felt familiar. The kind of song sung softly beside rivers for generations beyond counting. Across the village, oil lamps glowed inside open doorways while warm smells drifted from the cooking fires, lentils, onions, fresh bread, and fish roasting slowly above coals. The entire village seemed wrapped in calm golden light. Children eventually gathered closer to the fires while several older villagers began telling stories between the songs. One old man described traveling north many years earlier to help transport grain toward a large city beside the Nile. He spoke about crowded docks filled with boats larger than any the children had ever seen. Another woman described a flood season from her childhood when fish became trapped in shallow pools so large that families could catch them by hand. The stories drifted softly into the warm evening air while stars slowly multiplied above the village. For most families, nights like this carried deep comfort. The labor of the day had ended. Everyone sat together safely beneath the sky. The river flowed quietly nearby. And for a little while, no one needed to hurry anywhere. The flute music returned again. This time the melody sounded even slower. Almost sleepy. The younger children began resting their heads against parents and older siblings while listening to the soft notes moving through the darkness. Even the animals seemed calm tonight. Goats rested quietly beside fences. Dogs slept near the warmth of the fires. Somewhere beyond the fields, insects hummed steadily beneath the moonlight. The father looked toward the Nile. From where he sat, he could see silver reflections moving slowly across the water between dark reeds and shadowed boats tied near the shore. The river never stopped moving. Even during peaceful nights like this one, it continued its endless journey through Egypt, carrying life from one village to another. The farmer often found comfort in that thought. The Nile had flowed before his birth. It would continue after his death. And between those two moments, his family lived quietly beside its waters just as countless others had done before. The music slowly faded. For a few moments, no one spoke. The silence itself felt peaceful. Then the old grandmother who often told stories to the children lifted her voice softly once more. This time she spoke not about floods or markets, but about the stars above Egypt. She pointed toward the sky while the children followed her gaze. The river flows below, she whispered, and another river flows above. The children stared upward quietly at the pale band of stars stretching across the darkness. To them, the heavens looked endless. Mysterious. Beautiful. The grandmother smiled gently before continuing her story about ancient spirits traveling through the night sky beside celestial waters. The younger boy listened carefully while sleep slowly pulled at his eyes. The warmth of the fire, the soft voices, the cool night air, and the distant sound of the Nile all blended together around him. One by one, families slowly rose and returned toward their homes. Oil lamps disappeared behind mud brick doorways. The fires burned lower. The flute finally became silent. Above the village, the stars remained bright and calm. And beneath them, ancient Egyptian life drifted quietly toward another night of rest beside the river. Not all labor beside the Nile happened in the fields. Some of the most important work took place along the canals that carried river water through the fertile land surrounding the villages. Without those canals, the fields would dry beneath the fierce Egyptian sun. Without careful management of water, even the rich black soil left by the floods could become useless. And so throughout the year, groups of workers constantly repaired, deepened, widened, and protected the waterways connecting the Nile to the farms. One morning before sunrise, the farmer from the small mud brick house joined several other men preparing for canal work farther south of the village. The air felt cool and damp in the darkness. Oil lamps flickered softly beside the roads while workers gathered tools made from wood, rope, woven baskets, and bronze blades worn smooth from years of labor. The younger boy watched his father leave while standing sleepily in the doorway beside his mother. Today the work would be harder than usual. Canal labor demanded strength. Mud had to be removed. Walls reinforced. Collapsed sections repaired before water flow weakened across the fields. As dawn slowly brightened the eastern sky, the workers followed a narrow path beside the Nile toward the damaged canal. Birds called softly from the reeds. Mist hovered low above the water. The world still felt half asleep beneath the pale morning light. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached the canal system stretching across the farmland south of the village. Part of one embankment had weakened after the recent flood season. Water now leaked slowly into surrounding ground where it should not have flowed. The workers examined the damage quietly. Then the labor began. Some men climbed into the canal itself where cool muddy water reached their knees. Others carried baskets of wet earth to reinforce the crumbling sides. Wooden tools scraped heavily through thick mud while sweat slowly formed across backs and shoulders as the sun climbed higher. The farmer worked steadily beside the others. His hands already knew these movements well. Lift. Carry. Pack the mud tightly. Smooth the wall. Repeat. Again and again beneath the growing heat. Canal work connected entire villages together. Farmers understood that water could not belong to only one family. Every field depended on shared systems built and maintained through collective effort. If one section failed, many crops could suffer. And so neighbors worked side by side despite exhaustion. Above them, the Egyptian sky became bright blue beneath the rising sun. Birds occasionally landed near the canal edges searching for insects in the disturbed mud. Farther away, oxen moved slowly through planted fields while women carried water jars between villages along dusty roads. Life continued everywhere around the workers. The Nile Valley never truly stood still. By midday, the heat grew heavy. The workers rested briefly beneath woven shade coverings stretched beside the canal bank. Clay jars of water cooled in damp cloth while bread and onions passed quietly between tired hands. No one spoke very much. The labor consumed energy quickly beneath the sun. Still, there was comfort in resting together beside moving water while warm wind drifted across the fields. The farmer leaned back against the canal wall and closed his eyes for a moment. Nearby, another worker quietly hummed one of the slow evening songs often heard beside the village fires. The melody mixed gently with the sound of flowing water. After resting, the men returned once again to the canal. The damaged section already looked stronger now. Fresh mud reinforced the embankments while newly cleared channels allowed water to move more smoothly toward the fields beyond. This work would protect crops for many months. It mattered deeply even if few people outside the villages ever noticed it. By late afternoon, the workers finally finished. Their legs and hands were covered in mud. Their shoulders ached. But the canal flowed properly once again beneath the golden light of the lowering sun. The farmer washed his arms in the cool water before beginning the walk home beside the Nile. As he moved along the river path, he passed fishermen preparing nets for evening work and children chasing one another beside the reeds. Smoke already drifted upward from village cooking fires in the distance. The long day was ending. Soon families would gather once more beside warm lamps and simple meals while darkness settled softly across Egypt. And through the fields beyond the homes, water from the repaired canal would continue moving quietly through the fertile land beside the eternal river. Near the northern edge of the village, close to a quiet bend in the Nile, lived an old man who built boats. His home stood slightly apart from the others beneath two leaning palm trees whose shadows stretched across the riverbank each afternoon. Beside the house rested pieces of wood, coils of rope, bundles of reeds, and half-finished boats lying upside down upon wooden supports. The smell of river mud and fresh-cut wood always filled the air around his workshop. The old boat builder moved slowly now. Age had bent his back and stiffened his hands, yet his eyes remained careful and sharp whenever he worked beside the river. For many years he had shaped fishing boats, transport vessels, and small reed crafts for villages along this section of the Nile. Almost everyone nearby had traveled at some point inside one of his boats. The farmer from the small mud brick house often stopped there after working in the fields. Sometimes he needed repairs made to a fishing boat shared with relatives. Other times he simply rested for a few moments beside the water while the old man worked quietly nearby. One calm morning, the younger boy followed his father to the workshop. Sunlight reflected softly across the Nile while birds drifted low above the reeds. The river smelled fresh after the coolness of dawn, and small waves touched the muddy shore with gentle repeating sounds. The old boat builder sat upon a low stool carving wood carefully with a bronze blade. Thin curls fell quietly into the dust around his feet. Beside him rested the curved frame of a new fishing boat slowly taking shape beneath his hands. The younger boy stared at it with fascination. To him, boats seemed almost alive. They floated across the Nile carrying grain, fish, people, stories, and goods from one village to another. Some disappeared into the distance for days before returning again at sunset with weathered sails and tired fishermen aboard. The old builder noticed the child watching. Without speaking, he handed the boy a smooth piece of scrap wood and allowed him to touch the unfinished boat frame carefully. The wood felt warm beneath the sunlight. Strong. Patient. The boat builder returned to his work slowly, measuring each piece by memory more than tools. Years beside the river had taught him how wood should bend, how a rope should hold, how a boat must balance against the current and shifting winds of the Nile. Such knowledge could not easily be written. It lived inside the hands. Inside the eyes. Inside long memory. Nearby, the farmer helped repair fishing nets while the old man continued shaping the boat frame. The sounds around them remained soft and peaceful. Wood scraping gently. River water moving along the shore. Palm leaves rustling overhead. Farther away, faint voices drifted from the village where daily life had already begun. Women grinding grain. Children running through dusty roads. Workers heading toward the fields. Everything moved within its familiar rhythm beside the Nile. By midday, the heat grew stronger over the riverbank. The old boat builder rested beneath the shade of the palm trees while drinking cool water from a clay jar. The younger boy sat nearby listening carefully as the old man began speaking softly about earlier years upon the river. He described journeys made during flood seasons when the Nile spread so wide that entire fields disappeared beneath water. He remembered nights traveling under the stars carrying grain toward distant cities farther north. He spoke about storms. About crocodiles seen near southern marshes. About fishermen who knew the river better than dry land. The boy listened quietly while warm wind drifted through the reeds around him. To children in the village, the Nile often felt endless. A mysterious road leading toward places they could barely imagine. The old builder smiled faintly while looking out across the shining water. "The river changes every day," he said softly. "But it is always the same river." The child thought carefully about those words. Nearby, small fishing boats drifted slowly through the afternoon sunlight while white birds stood motionless in the shallows near the reeds. The old man eventually rose once more and returned to his work. Piece by piece, the new boat continued taking shape. Long wooden planks were tied carefully against the curved frame using rope soaked earlier in water to strengthen it. The builder checked every angle with patient attention because even small mistakes could become dangerous upon the Nile. A poorly balanced boat might sink during flood season currents. Weak rope might fail far from shore. Everything depended upon careful craftsmanship. As the afternoon slowly passed, the younger boy began helping in small ways. He carried tools, held rope steady, fetched water from the riverbank. The work made him feel proud. The old builder noticed this and nodded quietly without speaking much. In Egyptian villages, children learned through doing rather than long instruction. Skills passed naturally from older hands into younger ones beside fields, workshops, kitchens, and boats. The sun slowly lowered toward evening. Golden light spread across the Nile while long shadows stretched through the workshop. The unfinished boat glowed warmly beneath the fading sunlight, already beginning to resemble the vessels drifting nearby upon the river. The farmer finally stood and prepared to return home. The younger boy looked once more at the half-built boat before leaving beside his father. He wondered where it might travel someday. Perhaps to villages farther north. Perhaps through floodwaters under moonlight. Perhaps carrying fishermen through the morning mist before sunrise. Behind them, the old boat builder remained beside the river working quietly as evening settled over the Nile Valley once again. One evening, after many peaceful days beside the river, the younger boy from the small mud brick house became sick. At first it seemed small. He returned from playing near the canals quieter than usual and refused most of his evening meal. His mother touched his forehead gently while the cooking fire flickered nearby. His skin felt warm. Outside, the village continued normally beneath the soft evening sky. Neighbors spoke quietly near doorways. Smoke drifted upward from cooking fires. The Nile reflected fading orange sunlight beneath the approaching darkness. But inside the house, concern slowly settled over the family. The boy lay down early upon the woven mat while his sister watched him silently from nearby. Through the night, his fever grew stronger. The mother stayed awake beside him while cool cloth soaked in water rested across his forehead. The father sat near the doorway listening to the child's breathing while distant insects hummed outside in the darkness. Sickness was part of ancient life beside the Nile. Most villagers understood herbs, simple remedies, and careful treatments passed down through generations. Some illnesses faded quickly. Others frightened families deeply because medicine remained uncertain and fragile. The mother quietly prepared a drink using crushed herbs stored carefully inside small clay jars. An elderly woman from a nearby house arrived before dawn carrying additional remedies made from leaves, honey, and oils known throughout the village. The old woman moved slowly but confidently. She had cared for many sick children during her lifetime. She knelt beside the boy and spoke softly while placing another cool cloth upon his forehead. The child stirred weakly but did not fully wake. Outside, the first birds had already begun calling from the reeds beside the Nile. Morning arrived slowly over the village. But inside the small house, time seemed quieter now. More careful. The father did not go to the fields that morning. Instead he remained beside his son while the mother rested briefly after staying awake through most of the night. Sunlight slowly entered through the doorway, touching the mud brick walls with pale gold color. The smell of herbs mixed with smoke from the low cooking fire while soft village sounds drifted faintly from outside. Children laughing somewhere farther down the road. Donkeys moving beside fences. Water jars scraping gently against stone. Ordinary life continued around them. Yet the family's attention remained focused entirely upon the sick child resting quietly upon the mat. By midday, the fever still had not broken. The younger boy slept uneasily while sweat covered his forehead and chest. His sister sat silently beside him holding his small carved wooden bird from the market. The mother whispered soft comforting words while changing the cloth upon his forehead again. Outside, the heat grew stronger across the Nile Valley. Workers moved slowly through the planted fields while irrigation water shimmered beneath the bright Egyptian sky. Boats drifted along the river as always. The Nile continued flowing calmly beyond the village walls. Inside the house, the old woman prepared another herbal mixture and encouraged the child to drink small amounts of water mixed with honey. The boy opened his eyes briefly. His mother smiled gently with relief. Even that small movement felt important now. Hours passed quietly. The father stepped outside only once to wash his face beside the clay water jar near the doorway. He looked toward the river for a long moment while warm wind crossed the village roads. Life beside the Nile could feel peaceful and steady. But moments like these reminded every family how fragile ordinary happiness truly was. Children could become sick suddenly. Floods could fail. Storms could damage homes and crops. Nothing remained guaranteed beneath the Egyptian sky except the slow movement of time itself. As evening approached, the fever finally began to lessen. The younger boy woke more fully and asked softly for water. His mother nearly cried with relief. The old woman smiled quietly while preparing another cool cloth. Outside, sunset painted the village in soft orange light while neighbors returning from the fields heard the good news and offered calm grateful words before continuing toward their homes. The father finally stepped outside and breathed deeply beneath the evening sky. Smoke from cooking fires drifted through the village once more. The Nile shimmered peacefully beyond the reeds while birds crossed low above the water searching for places to rest before nightfall. Everything looked ordinary again. And because of that, everything suddenly felt precious. Inside the house, the younger boy now slept peacefully beside his sister while the mother quietly prepared a simple evening meal. The oil lamp glowed softly against the mud brick walls. Warm night air drifted through the doorway. And beyond the village, beneath the first stars appearing over Egypt, the eternal river continued flowing through darkness once more. Night returned to the Nile Valley like it always did. Slowly. Without sound. Without hurry. The last traces of daylight faded from the western horizon, and the sky above the village deepened into a calm, endless blue. One by one, stars appeared, scattered across the darkness like soft points of light watching over the land. The village had grown quiet again. Oil lamps glowed gently inside mud brick homes. Cooking fires had settled into low warm embers. Doors were closed. Mats were spread. Families lay down after long days shaped by work, water, and sun. Inside the small house near the edge of the village, the younger boy finally rested without fever. His breathing was calm now. Steady. His mother sat beside him for a while longer, watching quietly in the dim light of the oil lamp. His sister slept nearby, still holding the small carved wooden bird he loved. The father rested near the doorway, half awake, listening to the distant sounds of the night. Outside, the Nile moved silently through darkness. It did not stop. It did not change its rhythm. It simply continued, carrying reflections of stars across its surface while reeds whispered softly along the banks. Farther away, fishermen's boats rested tied to wooden posts. Canals flowed gently through the fields. Animals slept near fences and palm trees. Even the desert wind, which had once roared across the land, was now only a memory of dust and movement far beyond the horizon. Egypt felt still. Not empty. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that holds thousands of lives without ever needing to speak. Villages along the river shared the same night. Farmers sleeping after planting seasons. Potters resting beside drying clay. Boat builders dreaming beside the water. Women and children and elders all wrapped in the same slow rhythm of survival, woven together by the Nile. Because everything here, in the end, returned to the river. It fed the fields. It carried the boats. It shaped the seasons. It held the villages together without ever asking for anything in return. The night deepened further. Stars brightened above the valley. And somewhere in the distance, a soft breeze moved through palm leaves, carrying the scent of water and earth across the sleeping land. Inside the house, the boy turned slightly in his sleep, peaceful now. His mother finally rested beside him. The father closed his eyes. And the village, like so many others along the Nile, surrendered fully to the calm of night. No beginning felt sudden here. No ending felt final. Only cycles. Water rising. Water retreating. Seeds planted. Fields growing. Children sleeping. Children waking. life continuing in the same gentle pattern, again and again, beside the river that never stopped moving. And as the night stretched endlessly over ancient Egypt, the Nile flowed on beneath the stars, quiet, steady, and eternal.